My name is Bruce Kane, and I'm the director of the Bill Lane Center for the American West. And we're pleased that you could join us today for Justin Farrell's talk, Billionaire on Billionaire Wilderness, his latest book. Justin is a professor at Yale in sociology, but more importantly, he was born in Wyoming and has deep roots in the West. In fact, he's going to be broadcasting to us allegedly from Denver. So while he's working on his next book. So we're quite pleased to have Justin. We've used Justin as a speaker in another event we had in Utah on the changes in the rural economies and the rise of what we call the amenity West, but he'll explain it in greater detail. Justin has written extensively on subjects in the West, and including a book that preceded this on Yellowstone called The Battle for Yellowstone. And as I said, he's working on a book on energy and COVID and various other topics as they relate to the West. So we're really pleased to have Justin. So our format is, as we did last time, Justin will speak for approximately 20 or 30 minutes. Then at the end of that, we invite you to submit questions to us through either Q&A, that's our preferred mode, but if you want to, you can also do it through chat. I'll toggle back and forth between the two. I will pick out questions from the list. Where I see several questions that overlap with one another, I will try to consolidate them. So if you think you've asked a question similar to that, you probably did, but I was just consolidating so that we could, in the interest of time, get as many of these questions answered as possible. So this book, I will just say, is a very timely book. We at the Bill Lane Center have something called the Rural West program, and the kinds of issues that Justin is grappling with are very much big issues right now in the Rural West in terms of the changing economy and the gentrification of new owners coming in and buying up ranches. And it relates, I think, somewhat to issues in the COVID where communities are telling second owners they can't come back, and maybe he'll tell us something about that as well. Anyway, Justin, I hand it over to you to tell us about Billionaire Wilderness.
Great, thanks, Bruce. So yeah, over the past few years, it's been really fun getting to know the folks at the Bill Lane Center, a center that I admire as the place in the nation really for scholarship and public engagement on the North American West. And so it's really an honor for me, to present some work for you. At Yale, I run a research lab full of students doing interdisciplinary research on the West. Although mostly, it might just be a support group for those of us stuck on the East Coast. We talk about that a lot. But after arriving at Yale in 2014, I started a Yale North American West Initiative, as I call it, this kind of loose gathering of students and some other faculty, just to support interdisciplinary work across the natural and social sciences, as well as the humanities. And so a lot of my work and a lot of my students' work is very problem oriented. And we're always kind of doing work aimed at solutions and policy solutions and collaboration in the West. And as Bruce mentioned, lately that's having to do with changing economies, which is reshaping the West in all sorts of different ways. Relative to the COVID, just quickly before I start in on the book, one of the questions we're trying to understand, is within the rural West specifically, responses to COVID, responses to expanding federal programs with the $2.2 trillion aid package and so forth. And so we're launching a representative survey with the help of the National Science Foundation in the next week or so across 11 states in the West. And so I'm happy to talk more about that. You can email me if you're interested. But I'm here, to talk about my new book. And I'm going to start with just, what motivated the research, and then just kind of give an overview of the research questions. These sorts of talks on a book are difficult because there's so much in there. But I'm going to just briefly then cover some of the data and methods that I use, and then really try to get to the main findings in the book that I unpack obviously in the book. And then I'm really excited to hear your questions. And so I'm back to what motivated the research. Most of it I started with what I saw were some significant gaps in research, and not just in the West, but on wealth and wealth concentration in general. But first, as with many researchers, it began with personal experience. As Bruce mentioned, I was born in Wyoming and spent a lot of time in the greater Yellowstone area and up in Idaho as well. And I've just long been fascinated with the ways the Rocky Mountain West in particular is growing and changing. And so I've kind of just been doing that my whole career, and it's such a dynamic and complex place. And the past 6 years, I've really focused on how extreme wealth and again, as Bruce mentioned, gentrification, you could call it, is reshaping the region. And as I write in the foreword, I open the foreword of the book, the little story about, when I was younger, I would join my mother, who she was a house cleaner at some larger homes. And I think those experiences also just kind of made me curious about wealth, about wealthy folks, and how they think about themselves, how they think about other people. And so when I, was pursuing a new research topic, I discovered that there's just so much that we don't know, especially about those at the very top of the socioeconomic pyramid. We have a lot of what are more impersonal economic reports about, the declining middle class, the concentration of wealth at the very top, which is obviously critical research, and we need more of it. But we lacked more in-depth studies on the ground, so to speak, and with the rich, with the wealthy, again, understanding, using social scientific methods, how they think about wealth in America, how they think about their communities, how they think about the environment. So we either had these economic reports, which, frame my analysis, and I'll get into some of that. But then I was just unsatisfied with the other side of things, where there would often be, more zealous or voyeuristic exposés of the rich and famous, more you would see in the media, that I found to be sloppy, unscientific, and at times just unhelpful. And so when I set out on this project, I really aimed to do a more rigorous study that had, a research design that would kind of capture all the elements reliably, all the questions that I was interested in. I would say also that when we think of inequality and wealth concentration, we tend to think of it as an urban phenomenon. But I make the case in the introduction of the book that it is very much a rural phenomenon. It impacts rural areas, and that we can't write off, especially wealthy enclaves in the West, places like Jackson Hole that I'll talk about, as some sort of sideshow or rich and famous type endeavor. But the numbers really show across the West that there are some serious patterns emerging, and it does have to do with how economies are changing. But it also has to do with the number of ultra wealthy people we have in our country and how that's growing year by year. So the findings in my book, and what I really set out to do, was to point to a much larger drama unfolding, in communities across the West, not just in Teton County and Jackson Hole. And so I was trying to write something that had a broader impact. So this all brought me to a place that I know very well, which is Teton County, Wyoming. And that is, for those of you who don't know, that is home to Jackson Hole. It is home to the Teton Mountains, Grand Teton National Park. And, many people know it. Families have vacationed here for generations to see Yellowstone, to see the Grand Tetons, and to just experience that area. But this, once kind of backwater town, relatively modest community, has now become the richest county in the US in terms of per capita income, and is also almost as high as in median income, as well as the county with the largest gap between the rich and the poor. So there's uber wealth has moved in. And so I argue again that, this global storyline that we're seeing about wealth concentration, we can't really see it anywhere more clearly than here in this little corner of the Rocky Mountains. And For me, this was a perfect social laboratory to study the ultra wealthy, to study the changing West. Just to give you a sense of how much wealth, so per capita income in Teton County, it hovers around 250,000. I believe that's about 50 to 60,000 dollars higher than the second place, if you want to rank it, and which is Manhattan. The top 1% there earn an average of about 28 million a year, and the majority of income is from financial investments rather than a salary or ordinary job. And so the amount of wealth flooding into some of these communities, like Teton County, is quite staggering. And then you layer on, in Wyoming at least, a lack of any income tax or corporate tax. You have this perfect storm. But again, I saw that as an opportunity to do this project. I want to stop and share my screen real quick just to kind of give you a sense of where I'm talking about and kind of what it looks like. So this, for those of you who don't know, there's a Tetons there on the right, but Teton County, Wyoming is just up in the northwest corner, again, right near Yellowstone. This is a graph of per capita income. I'm not going to present a whole bunch of quantitative data, but this kind of shows you how in about 1990, the average income in the United States and how Teton County just took off and skyrocketed. Kind of move here, let's see here. And you can see really since 2000, the curve really steepens. This graph here just shows the growth in investments income relative to labor, to give you a sense of things. In
Justin, there are people saying they're not able to view the screen.
Oh, okay.
Did you share it? Did you hit the share screen?
Yeah, I can try again here.
Okay, I think he said he can see it now, so I think we're good.
Okay. All right, cool.
All right,
Thanks.
All right. Okay.
Yeah, let me know if this doesn't work. But so to give you a sense of the amount of investment income, rather than just an ordinary job or labor, 8 out of every $10 in 2015, so 80% of income in this county came from financial investments and dividends. So 80%. This also has brought inequality or worsened inequality. So here is a trailer park right downtown that was demolished and replaced with a new hotel. This was, a controversial project in the community. Kind of give you a sense of, what it looks like in Jackson Hole. This here is a picture of a woman named Blanca Gonzalez, who was given 30 days to vacate the trailer park. And these sorts of stories are common. And in the last section of the book, I kind of go into those based on the interviews with the low income and working poor. Here's kind of what some of the new builds look like. So this is a private club in town. Just kind of contrast, something like this. This is a club, and then this is one of the homes in town that was for sale, I think, a few years ago. I think it was 35 million, if I'm remembering correctly. But basically, this just kind of gives you a sense of, if you haven't been to this corner of the Rockies, what it looks like, and kind of the amount of wealth there, but also the disparity in wealth. So my research questions, I really had two related areas of inquiry. First, kind of as I've been discussing, I wanted to know how wealth concentration and wealth inequality is impacting these rural Western communities. So this is more of a general question about wealth and the West, and obviously always connecting it to these national patterns of growing wealth concentration. Second, though, I use this project as an opportunity, and it was just as important for me to dig more deeply into this subculture of our society, namely the lives of the ultra wealthy and this social class of people. Just as sociologists study, social class, and they study sort of who's, oftentimes in my discipline, there's more attention given to those at the bottom, those that are losing out, those that are discriminated against. And so I tried here to flip it on its head and say, well, why don't we look at the other side of things why don't we look at kind of who's benefiting from some of these systems, whether they really know it or not. And so I wanted to kind of do that from in a firsthand perspective with the ultra wealthy. So trying to understand and even just asking them how they see themselves, how they see other people, how they see the natural environment. So I asked them all sorts of questions about, why did their lives turn out the way that they did? Does great wealth, for example, make life more difficult, like some people say, or do they have trouble sleeping at night, like some people might say they should? Do they feel guilty at all? What's their connection to the natural environment? Why do some of them love the West so much, the rural West or the mythical rural West? And I'll kind of get into that here when I talk about the findings. And so my approach was quite broad in that I was focused on this intersection of extreme wealth, of a community, and then the environment and the ecosystem that encircles all of those things. And then you throw in, public lands issues, but I won't go into that as much. But for me, it was this fascinating case study where I could take on some really big issues, not just in the West, but just, going on right now in the United States, and get access to this population that I thought, needed to be studied in more depth. In terms of data and methods, I'm happy to answer, any questions about this, and I have a lengthy appendix, but just briefly, it was based on 5 years of observational research and a couple hundred, 205 in-depth interviews with the ultra wealthy. And then I pair this with various quantitative data on economic change, on amenity growth, on philanthropic networks, and the like. And then finally, I conducted with an organization in town 50 interviews with the low income and working poor, many of whom work for the ultra wealthy, either directly or indirectly, through caretaking homes or construction, gardening, working for example, at the airport, in the area where the private jets come in, just to get a firsthand account of, I've asked all the ultra wealthy all these questions. I have all this data. I wanted to understand what for those who interact with the ultra wealthy, either indirectly or directly, what they think of what the ultra wealthy have told me, what life is really like in this community. And I would say many of these interviewees were Spanish speaking and were immigrants from a small community in Mexico. So there were also some interesting questions revolving around being documented or undocumented, and racial and ethnic discrimination, and again, what it's like to live in the rural West as a recent immigrant, or even a longtime immigrant as well. So just kind of get to my findings here. So I unpacked these through 12 chapters, and there's 3 different sections in the book. And just in terms of my main finding, to kind of put an umbrella over it, nature, and especially nature in these Western rural communities, and the culture of these rural communities really becomes an ideal setting for the ultra wealthy to resolve these existential dilemmas that they face as moneyed people. And I discovered most of this, through the ethnographic observation and through just all the hundreds of hours of interviewing. And these existential dilemmas they face, I break them out into 2 categories. And so there are these economic dilemmas. So, they've made all this money. How should they best enjoy it? How should they share it? How should they protect it? How should they multiply it? So that's sort of economic side of things. And they're related, but distinct is the social side of things. So how do they wrestle with and respond to these social stigmas, the status anxiety that they may feel, or feelings of inauthenticity, or feelings of guilt? And so being an ultra wealthy person in America, it kind of cuts both ways. They're stigmatized as inauthentic, as greedy monsters, and this and that. but they're also kind of praised as well, and held up as something all Americans should strive for. And so these social stigmas, how do they wrestle with those, and how does nature provide a way to satisfy some of those dilemmas? How do Western rural communities, or at least this mythic version of those communities, again, help them tackle these problems of maybe feeling inauthentic or guilty? So let me unpack this a bit. I'll unpack it in two different ways. So first, I'll focus on how they, put nature to use, as I say it, in some really interesting and unique ways to resolve these dilemmas. So, for example, as some of the pictures that I showed, their immense wealth ensures private access to the healing tonic of nature, and in fact, many of the folks that I talk to, they believe that they especially deserve nature's healing touch because of their high stress careers, working on Wall Street or working in Silicon Valley, or just these working long hours, and they sort of sense that they have deserved or earned the right to downshift, to recharge their batteries, or as some people put it, to become whole again. And what's interesting too is that the enjoyment and protection of nature becomes akin to these other highbrow tastes that they have. And so I call this in the book, connoisseur conservation, that Teton County and the Tetons and Yellowstone and that whole area is the best that nature has to offer, in the same way that they might enjoy upscale art or the finest wine. And that's how they would describe nature in this area. And so the darker side of this, though, is that escaping to nature for its therapeutic remedy often served to morally justify the natural resources it took to build and sustain their massive homes in what is a precious ecosystem. And so I point out in the book, the different ironies and the different contradictions, and frankly, the hypocrisies in some cases that exist relative to their enjoyment of nature and their care for nature. And I also point out in some cases, depending on the interviewee, this communion with nature that they find to be valuable is often paid for with money that was earned in industries, causing climate change or contributing to global ecological ruin. And so there are those ironies as well, and those contradictions. I also focus within this section on, environmental philanthropy. And after moving to some of these areas, people become environmentalists and how to, or become conservationists, and they give generously of their time and money to local causes. But again, I found that, even environmental philanthropy is not always what it seemed, that they are able to leverage nature, this idea of nature, for their own benefit. And so I point out, using all sorts of philanthropic data and social network data in the community and giving data about who is getting the philanthropic dollars that are flowing. And so oftentimes it would go to these environmental and arts organizations, yet the social services groups who are struggling in the shadow of great wealth inequality. Their balance sheets are mostly emaciated and do not even grow near the rate these other groups. The other kind of contradiction I point out is the way that land conservation can become a lucrative way to claim a tax break, again, under the banner of environmental altruism. And then finally, conservation also serves as this elite social function in the community. And this may not surprise some of you, but that conservation itself is needed to, or the activity of environmentalism is, at least in Teton County, it carries social currency. It's needed to run in some of the elite social circles, and it often signaled one's status or prestige within the community. And then I would also add that they're oftentimes not recognizing the harm done by their presence, whether it is building a mansion in the middle of an animal migration corridor, or understanding the effect you have in creating a housing crisis. And so all this culminates in what I call an environmental veneer. So I argue that, you know, a lot of us tend to think about environmental conservation as this unquestioned good, that we don't tend to think about, or at least think enough about, the ways that caring for the environment actually benefits certain people, either financially through tax breaks or skyrocketing home values, or you know, an elite experience of nature, or even social prestige in the community. And it can generally, you know, reinforce many of the social mechanisms that give rise to environmental problems, you know, in the first place. And so that kind of section focuses on their interactions with nature and philanthropy in the community. In the second half of the book, and I'll move through this here so we can get to the questions, I show the unique ways that they wrestle with and respond to these social stigmas that I mentioned earlier. The social stigma of being rich, the social stigma, you know, that you feel like you need to prove to yourself and to others that money hasn't turned you into this out of touch monster, that it hasn't changed you, that you're still the same person, or that you're still an authentic person. You're still kind of have your sense about you and who you are. Interestingly, you know, to solve these dilemmas, my timer is going off here. Interesting, to solve these dilemmas, you know, I found that the ultra wealthy use rural people, or at least this vision they have of rural people, as a vehicle for personal transformation. So they create these new versions of themselves that they view as more authentic, virtuous, community-minded. And this was really surprising to me in terms of the extent to which this showed up in the interviews. And you know, it's based on this romanticized idea that of the West that has always been around, has always been used. But the way that it was used, I think, by the wealthy in this case, was really fascinating to me. So this idea of rural people and poverty, and romanticizing that, where, you know, low-income Westerners were imagined to be, you know, in kinship with nature, or free from the snares of wealth and power, and thought to live this noble life of contentment, and wilderness adventure, and small town community cohesion. And so in some ways, poverty was more like this ski bum or this hardworking rancher, rather than the reality, which in this community and many others is an immigrant family, you know, working a couple of jobs just to try to stay afloat. And so folks would, you know, ultra wealthy folks would talk about how normal they become when they move to the West, that they sort of shed their old identity, or at least turn it off when they're in these Western environments. And I tell a story, this guy named John, who made tens of millions as an oil and gas CEO, but since moving to Wyoming, you know, he's become passionate about becoming a normal person, and he wears Wranglers, he wears cowboy boots, and he, you know, told me story after story about all of his working class friends, and how you know, they accept him as this normal person. And it's not about money out there. It's, you know, just about everyone's in love with nature, everyone's in love with you know, going on hikes. And again, that social class just doesn't matter. You could be sitting in a coffee shop and somebody next to you could be a billionaire, but they look just like you do, and they act just like you do. And that's the beauty of this area. And so I probe into that quite a bit through multiple chapters. But again, just to conclude here, it does create this veneer, or that hides these massive economic and social disparities. It creates a veneer that all is well in paradise, when in reality there are these deep inequities, and these deep inequities not just in income, but in opportunities. It bestows these rewards for trivial acts of charity, and it hides over these patterns of structural harm that are being done in the community. And further, I think it alleviates the sense of personal guilt, and then kind of covers over the need to for any sort of real economic or political action to address these problems, whether they be local problems, but also global environmental problems, because you know, we're all just kind of getting along. I give money to the land trust, they conserve some land, I feel good about myself, those things. And so there's this community veneer that is also existing, or is there in the community. But I also think there are opportunities for change, for solution, for progress. And I try to write the book with an eye toward those sorts of things. And in the epilogue, I offer some thoughts on the future, you know, of wealth and the West. And that's really, I think, the work that needs to begin. And I'm hoping that this book will start those conversations and will kind of crystallize some of the issues that are going on, and some in a constructive and hopefully eventually a collaborative way. I'm going to stop there and leave some time for Q&A. So I look forward to hearing what you think.
All right, well, there's a lot there. There are several questions about the actual interviewing. First of all, how representative were the ultra elite that you were interviewing of the community in terms of, say, Republicans versus Democrats, age, et cetera? And then secondly, what was the reception you got from these people? Because let's face it here, Justin, you're a little bit critical on the side, you know, on their motives and what they're trying to get at. So what kind of reaction are you getting when you present this to them? So two first things, are they representative of do you feel like you really have a representative sample of the ultra elite?
Yeah, I do in terms of demographics, and I probably oversampled a little bit on women, just because there's so few ultra wealthy women. If you look at the data, and the data are hard to come by, but some of the most reliable comes from WealthX, which is a firm that studies the ultra wealthy. But what I did in the appendix, people can look at that, is trying to match up my sample with what we know about the ultra wealthy nationally. I select on the ultra wealthy who choose to move there, though, and so that's the difference. Those who would, you know, choose to buy a home and spend, you know, anywhere from 2 weeks there, which would be rare, to, you know, have been there for 30 years in Teton County, and you know, there are many who move there and they can work and do their job from there just as well as if they were in New York. And I have a lot of stories about that, and what we know about the new West economy, and you know, working remotely. Your question about have I heard from the ultra wealthy and what do they think about this? It really depends who you talk with. The ones who I've spoken with, you know, which again is a distorted sample, because there are probably some who would disagree with my findings. But the ones who value and appreciate research, even if the outcomes are, you know, personally uncomfortable, have been very receptive and complimentary. I've received, since the book's been out, I guess it's been out about a month, almost 2 months now, 2 months actually. It's been pretty positive. I, you know, will sometimes get occasional, like I would say, hate mail, but about either I'm a socialist on one hand and just kind of jealous that I'm not rich. But those have not come from folks that I've interviewed. And I continue to have pretty good relationships with several interviewees. So I'm either called kind of a socialist on one hand, or I've gotten a lot of blowback about being too empathetic in the book to the wealthy, and that I needed to be more critical. And that was even in the review process. There were, you know, that was like, you need to hammer this home more. But I did the best I could in terms of being accurate and being as impartial as one can be. And so, you know, I've kind of tried to walk that line. And neither I'm, you know, in terms of the critiques that are levied against me are accurate, or I think represent the book. The topic itself lends itself, you know, if you just saw the title or read the back of the book or something, you would kind of like, oh, this is just an attack on the rich. But I hope that people can kind of see beyond that.
Okay, well, Justin, you got a lot of questions here, so
Right.
let's try to go through them as concisely as we can. So I'm going to put two of them here, one from Helene and one from Tom, that are basically asking the question, what are the benefits? Never mind the sort of personal issues that people bring in the motives. A lot of things that you say could be true of philanthropy across the country, right? Why do people give libraries? Why do they give buildings, et cetera? So let's talk about what the effect is on the community. And people want to know, what are the benefits that were brought and what are the alternatives? Because a lot of these communities, of course, are losing their extractive industries. They have to turn to something. And by the way, tourism is, you know, a real problem, is going to be really a problem if COVID is a persistent problem. You know, there aren't going to be as many people out there. So what are the alternatives, and what are the benefits that they may have brought? So let's give us the sort of positive light on what they might contribute, and then we can go to some of the fallacies of that if you'd like.
Oh yeah, no, I mean it props up the economy, and I've spoken with local government in Jackson in the past few weeks, and they're going to be hurting, and there is a reliance on tourism. And my project's not so much on just specifically the tourist economy. It's on this top level wealth that has moved into some of these areas, and how that.
No, I understand that. I didn't mean to say that. But
Yeah.
the real estate value itself must generate property tax, for example.
Oh yeah, certainly.
Yeah. So that's much what you mean in terms of helping the community, I would think.
Yeah, yeah, it is, and I think that looks differently in different states. In Wyoming, taxes are quite low, so this particular community, has what I would say an over-reliance on affluent philanthropy. That's not to say philanthropy in the community is critical. That's not to say that there are many generous people who, I have stories in the book like paying for 10 high schoolers, paying their entire college, and sending them to college. But I do think that there again is an over-reliance on philanthropy to save these communities, and that's a myth that needs to be overcome. And philanthropy indeed can help and is needed. And I had an article in the New York Times about folks flying to, just recently, like a couple weeks ago, flying to Teton County. But I also have in that article, the local community foundation raised, I think it was like $1.2 million in a relatively short period of time. And I think they've even raised much more than that. And that is helping offset some of the hardship caused by this pandemic. And it is not a linear story about the rich coming in and ruining this area, certainly. And I think
But are you, Justin, are you saying there's an ambivalence about all this help from the rest of the residents, the non-ultra, or are they really pleased and wish there was more of it?
So I have a chapter about the low income groups saying I'm very grateful for this, but then you also talk to, I think, folks who are more educated on the situation and kind of understand and say, well, we appreciate the philanthropy, but look where it's going. It's going just to these environmental organizations in a county where 97% of the land is federally owned. Another 2%, so there's like minuscule opportunities for conserving some of the land. Obviously, there's lots of important work that needs to be done with wildlife and all sorts of other environmental causes. But the disparity in terms of how much money is flowing and how little some of these organizations, who I call in the book, buzzkill organizations, they're working on issues that spoil this view of paradise. You don't move from New York to Teton County to hear about homelessness, to hear about hunger, and it can kind of again be this buzzkill. And so I've wrote a lot of interesting quotes with some of the lower income folks who are like, I think wealthy people care more about saving the local moose than saving the low-income neighbors from homelessness or contributing to the housing crisis.
Let's follow up on that, because Claude asked the question, and it's related to what you just said. Do the wealthy people treat the people that are working for them well? Do they pay them prevailing wages? Are they more generous than that? Talk a little bit about that, because you did talk to many of these people that work for the wealthy.
I did, yeah. So I rarely encountered somebody who worked for an ultra wealthy family who just outright said that they, were either rude to them. I have some of that, but on the whole, the perception of the ultra wealthy in the community is not one that is entirely negative, and it's not one that paints them necessarily with this broad brush. But there is a growing sense, especially in the last 3 or 4 years, that they need to step up and help solve some of the problems that are caused by this influx of wealth, and the ways that they enjoy this tax haven that is Wyoming. And so I think there's a sense that they need to kind of recognize the problems and not just treat it as this paradise where people don't actually live, who are trying to make their way and trying to survive, because they also enjoy living there as well. And so again, I would say no, it's not this this sense that they're all kind of jerks and they look down on them. If anything, they kind of romanticize the folks who have lived there for a long time, and oftentimes want to be friends with them because they're trying to kind of connect with this idea that they have about rural Western life.
Justin, let me, another aspect is, to what degree they share the lands that they buy. This is a question that was brought up by somebody here, and I want to just expand on that a bit. If you think about the other place that the uber wealthy went over the last 30 years in California, many of them went on to the coastal areas, which is now controlled by the Coastal Commission. And in fact, all the areas inside the Coastal Commission have become exceedingly more wealthy. But one thing the Coastal Commission has done very well is provide access to the beaches. And has a right for access to the beaches. So what about access to the lands that are purchased? Is there a kind of similar feeling that they're included or excluded? And if so, has any state sort of pioneered something similar to the way we give beach access in California?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in Teton County, which is pretty unique, like I said, that 97% of the land is already federally owned. And so you have parks and you have national forests. But I have a chapter in there on the Yellowstone Club, which is up in Montana. And it was the only area I studied outside of Teton County. And I did a lot of work on that chapter in terms of going to the club. And this is a ultra elite club, like Bill Gates belongs there. A lot of some celebrities, but a lot of just ultra wealthy people. In the surrounding community there is a sense that they've basically locked up this entire mountainside, and they have a ski resort there that rivals almost any ski resort in the West in terms of skiable acres and connections to Big Sky. And so that's an overt kind of way that they have locked up the land. But the folks in Teton County, there's not a sense that, they're buying up all the land and locking it away from people to fish or hike through their property or anything like that. And so it's not, I would say I couldn't compare it as much to what's going on maybe in California or in some places in Colorado, but the institutions that are created, for example, like the Yellowstone Club, or there's a fairly new club in Jackson Hole called Shooting Star, that again, many people were upset that was built just because of its footprint, and it's private, it's gated. So I think when you see those overt examples of wealth and the way that it's privatizing nature, so to speak, it rubs people the wrong way. But it's not as big of a problem in Teton County because there's so much public land.
Yeah. So a question here, and we should say as a background, Wyoming is known as the energy state, and a fair amount of their revenue comes from royalties and various other taxes related to the energy industry. And as a result, it goes up and down when the economy is going, when energy is much in demand, they're doing great. And a lot of times they're not doing so great. So you raised this issue that it's kind of a tax haven. Is that an ongoing argument about whether the state should take take on this tax haven and try, because certainly the whole question of what size of the royalty they get on federal lands is a big issue in Wyoming. So has anybody brought this up? Is there any debate or discussion about this, or is it not discussed at all?
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating because it depends on who you talk with. So for those who aren't familiar with Wyoming, most Wyomingites outside of Jackson, outside of Teton County, don't consider that Wyoming. And what's ironic for me is that Wyoming, again, they're facing, a tough future with the decline of coal, oil, gas struggling, and that making up, the majority of their economy. Yet there isn't really a serious conversation, at least in Cheyenne and the capital, or among political leaders, to tax for example, Teton County. So all of Wyoming is a tax haven in some ways, but the most desirable places to live are in this area of Teton County. And so for me, I ponder that. I said, for a state that in some ways resents the fact that people from New York, people from, no offense, California, are coming there, but they're unwilling to require more from them. And that to me is just kind of I think an ongoing conversation. And I do wonder whether or not the decline of coal and how oil and gas is falling off, whether that's going to spark any conversation. But the state itself just has this cultural allergy to any sort of taxation, any sort of government intervention like that. And so I would be surprised if they did.
So actually, we should have asked this a little earlier. What fraction of these people are sort of second home? That is, it's not their residence, it's their second home. And what fraction actually end up becoming, full-time residents in Wyoming? And related to that is whether or not they're full-time residents, to what degree are they integrated into the local politics and policy making of Jackson Hole, for example?
Yeah, folks who have been there a long time, no surprise, are better integrated and understand that 30% of the population are Latino and Latina, and so there's an understanding of that. Lately, there have been more and more folks just kind of flying in and out, and some of the longtime wealthy residents that I spoke with, again, lament that. They worry that it's going to become an Aspen, the next Aspen. They really cherish this idea that they are really this small rural town that still has this character, that still that you don't see a lot of Teslas or other expensive cars driving around. People don't wear flashy clothing, and that is changing. And so that's changing because I think people who don't necessarily live there year round or even live there half the year, the requirements in Wyoming to be considered a resident are quite lean compared to other states. And so those conversations were always kind of delicate. So it was difficult for me to get an accurate read on who is actually living there as a resident and who is not, because it has tax implications. And so I don't report any of those numbers in the book because it was so difficult to know. But my sense is that there are more people in recent years who are not spending as much time there.
Okay, so we have a couple questions that are related. Felicity and Mason. Mason asked the question, well, are there examples of similar mountain towns that have found a more positive path than the one you've seen? And Felicity asked a similar question to that, which is, to what extent would you give advice? What would have been a better way for Jackson Hole to have handled these things? So they're kind of related as to what would be the best practice for integrating in the ultra wealthy.
I'm not an economist, so I tread lightly on this point. But in terms of my main recommendation in the epilogue, I do think somehow these communities need to require more from the super rich. And and again, I wade carefully into these waters, but I do think that many people use the state of Wyoming just, to save, for some, hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, for some millions of dollars a year. in taxes. And so figuring out a way that these communities can move away from being reliant on the whims of the generosity of the ultra wealthy to fund social services, and that more must somehow be required and to move into these towns, even for a few weeks a year. And so that's kind of my main, that sounds vague, I know, but that, and I go into more detail in the epilogue. The other thing is figuring out a way to, and this is more of a positive approach, I think, to draw on the oftentimes well-meaning desires of the super rich who move into these areas, who do want to, or who are attracted to these rural areas and the qualities that these rural areas do actually have. And in terms of being a small town, in terms of, you know, seeing folks at the coffee shop and supporting local organizations. And so there is this desire that I think could be harnessed for good. And so folks who move in, and I want to be clear about this, they're not coming in to ruin the community. Many of them are just coming in, and if they don't spend a lot of time there, they're just unaware of the problems. And you know, I think we should have an expectation that we can maybe educate them better, but finding ways to draw on that sensibility that they do want to be part of the community, and they want to be seen as a normal person. And I think that could be an entry into some, you know, collaborative efforts. And I am hopeful of that, because I don't think that they're, you know, they are sort of flying in and they don't care about the area, or they don't, you know, that's not the case. And I've even heard from, to your first question, Bruce, you know, folks who have read the book, ultra wealthy people who live there, and like, what can I do better? I just sent, before I was on this call, an email to one of my interviewees, a local article in the newspaper about this issue, and he wants to get involved. And so I think there's opportunity there, and I'm hopeful that at least the book for it, you know, it is critical when it needs to be, but I do think it will spark some hopefully productive conversations about these solutions.
Now, Justin, it may be kind of a mishearing of what you're saying, but some of the listeners wonder about what the missing middle, okay? The middle class people, the shop owners, the professionals, where are they in all of this mix that you're talking about in terms of the contributions of the ultra rich and what it owes to the community, et cetera?
Yeah, so that group of folks, at least in Teton County, is smaller than other areas. And I, just in terms of my research design, I do focus my case study, which is, you know, we call it an extreme case study, because it can really illuminate some of these issues in stark relief. I don't focus so much on that middle group, but they are, you know, the shop owners, fishing guides, teachers, police officers, those sorts of folks. They're there, and they are kind of caught in this mix. But what I heard over and over again in the interviews is like people who maybe, you know, this woman who was an executive director of one of the nonprofits, she can't afford to live there anymore, so they're moving out of town. Or the last police officer just moved out of town. Or so the story was less about kind of their unique or independent role, and more about how that middle was being hollowed out, and how they're forced to live, you know, 45 minutes away over a mountain pass rather than in the community in which they work. But that is a question that I'm kind of turning to now, is kind of what is the role of that group? And it will look differently in different communities, for sure. But that's definitely one of the kind of, in terms of my book, one of the gaps that needs to be filled moving forward.
Now, speaking of gaps, are there groups that are nonprofit groups, or I don't know, Latino groups, or other kind of groups that might be advocating for the interests of the rural poor in these communities? Did you run into any of that, or is it pretty much unorganized, the voice of the poor in these communities?
You know, that was the topic of the last section of the book. I have a couple chapters on that, and I worked with one of those groups to do the interviews with the working poor, and I still keep in touch with several people from that community. They've been underfunded for the last 20 years, but things are changing, and I'm actually optimistic moving forward. and their voice is being heard, in terms of advocating for rent control, advocating for, eviction notices that are more than a couple days or 30 days even. So those groups are gaining strength. And I do think that even some of the ultra wealthy people in the community now recognize the value of those groups. I don't know kind of what's going on within the last probably 6 months since the research has sort of ended, but those groups are front and center, and I think they're hopefully growing in strength.
And do many of the less advantaged people, are they voters or are they non-citizens for the most part and not really able to vote?
Both. I believe the current, from what I understand, I don't get in too much into the nitty gritty details of the day-to-day politics, but the current mayor, I believe, rode that wave of folks who are advocating for structural change. I think he rode them to office. And some of the organizations have hosted protests and done things that are more overt, like in the town square. And so you're seeing some of these sentiments play out in real ways, whereas 10 years ago there may have been a handful of organizations working with this Spanish-speaking community, for example, so they're not evicted or so they can understand their rental contract. But again, those groups I think are growing in strength, so which is good.
Okay, well, it's medically proven that spending more than 1 hour on one of these sessions is bad for your mental and physical health. So we don't want to cause massive problems on top of COVID by extending this any longer than we should. But Justin, that was great. And the book is Billionaire Wilderness, and you can buy it, I think, in a lot of different bookstores, according to Justin. It's out there. His book tour got kind of canceled, so he hasn't been able to spread the word. So if those of you who are interested in this topic, we really urge you to get it. He's a very good writer, I will tell you that, and he's got lots of good qualitative data. It's not, full of data and statistics like a book by Bruce that you would never want to read. This is actually something I want to read. So Justin, thanks so much. We really appreciate your stopping by and talking about your book. And to the rest of you, we have some more events coming up. We have a talk coming up on Monterey and the history of Monterey and Steinbeck and the relationship with the community coming up very soon. So we'll continue to do these things, spotlighting different aspects of the American West. And Justin, once again, thank you very much, and hope we get to see you in the future on your next book.
Great. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you all. Appreciate you all joining.
Okay. Bye.